All right, we're back. Before we start, I just want to say that in the previous video, I had mentioned towards the end about the negative effects of high ISOs when you're taking pictures. I'm actually going to do a video on that subject on its own, as well as the shutter speed and aperture. So stay tuned for those videos. That's going to be coming on down the road. Next, I want to say that if you haven't watched part one, I'm going to link it up here. I highly recommend you watch that one first because it'll be easier for you to follow in this video. With that said, let's get the exposure triangle up here. And this is a visual representation of the reciprocity we were talking towards the end of the last video. So on the left side, you can see the ISO. On the right side, you see the shutter speed, and then the bottom, you see the aperture. What you can see is that, and these are labeled in full stops. So remember how we were talking about when you let more light in, you double the amount. When you let less light in, you halve the amount. Well, this is what we're talking about in terms of numbers in your settings. So if you go from, we'll take the ISO. So if you take 800 to 1600, that makes your sensor more sensitive to light. Therefore, you double the light coming in. Conversely, on the shutter speed, we go from, say, 1/60th to 1/25th of a second. We're making the shutter speed faster. Therefore, there's less light coming in. And when we go from 160 to 125, that's half the amount of light coming in. Aperture, same thing. When you open up the iris, more light comes in. When you close down the iris, less light comes in. So in the exposure triangle or the reciprocity, what it's saying is if you take the shutter speed of 1/25th and then you have to drop it to make it slower or make it faster, then you can take the ISO and you can change that number to correspond to make your exposure brighter or darker. Same with the aperture, and that's the reciprocity. So basically you can change one setting because you need it specifically for something. So let's go with the shutter speed, right? I'm at 1/1000th of a second because I'm trying to freeze action, say wildlife or sports, racing, whatever the case may be. Well, because I have such a fast shutter speed, there's less light coming in. Therefore, my exposure is dark. Well, then I can take the ISO or the aperture and then change those settings so I can make the picture, the exposure, brighter. And that's the reciprocity of the exposure triangle. Now, how light is actually measured is called stops. In photography terms, you have full stops, half stops, and 1/3 stops. Now, in the last video, I was counting at 1, 2, 3, and then one full stop, 1, 2, 3, one full stop. I have my camera set at 1/3 exposure value because it's more fine-tuned as far as being able to hit a correct exposure, especially in my creative vision. So in the practicals, I'll help you set that up. So when I talk about how the ISO goes from 800 to 1600, that is one full stop. Now, 1600 is more sensitive, therefore it lets more light in. Now, in photography terms, that is called one stop brighter, which means it doubles the amount of light coming in. Conversely, when we go from 1600 to 800, we're making the sensor less sensitive, therefore less light is coming in. And then because it's a full stop, then we half the amount of light coming in. So that is the basics of exposure. Everything is in full stops as far as how light comes in and out, measuring. So double the amount of light or half the amount of light. But in the cameras, you can set to all the way to 1/3 to, like I said, when you're doing a creative or you have to be technical and be right on the money with your exposure, those fine-tuned settings help very much. Okay, let's talk about your in-camera light meter. So there's two types, and I will put the first one up, and it's the most common one that you see with DSLRs. And it's basically a scale where you have 0 in the middle, then you have your bright or overexposed, and then you have your darker or underexposed. So 0, then +1, +2, and +3. So the 1, 2, and 3 represent 1 stop brighter, 2 stop brighter, or 3 stops brighter than 0, which is your correct exposure. And then on the other side, you have -1, -2, and -3. Conversely, those are underexposures by -1 stop, -2 stops, -3 stops. That's your most common light meter representation or light meter image or picture that is on your camera. The next one I'm going to put up, and this is from a screenshot of my camera, and you can see that it has that 0.0, it's actually ±0.0. That is a light meter also, but it's digital, so it just tells me it'll have a, so mine is set to 1/3 stop. So if I have underexposed by a stop and some change, it'll have 1.3, and that tells me that I am 1 1/3 stops underexposed. And that's basically the light meter. Now, when we get into the practical, I will talk a little bit more about how the light meter in your camera actually works, because it does get fooled. And I don't remember, but I believe I covered it a little bit in the previous video. But there's another light meter, and it's called an incident light meter, and that basically reads the light that is falling onto your subject. Now, your camera is a reflective meter, and like I said, when we talk in the practical, I will actually show you how it works. Okay, and that is the light meter. And check my notes here. All right, so that is it for this part. We're going to get started with our practical, so I'll see you in a minute. Hey everyone, we are back. All right, to set up your camera to 1/3 stops, we're going to go into our menu system. Now remember, if you're not on a Sony, that's what I have right now, your menu system is going to look different. So I suggest that you either go through and actually play with your menus and get familiar with it, or you can read your manual, or better yet, go to YouTube and research your particular camera to be able to change the settings. So with that, let's go in here. So we'll go into menu, go up, and you'll see I am on tab 1, then page 10 of 14. Then we go down 1 and 2 items down, so you can see exposure step. So I'm already set at 0.3 or 1/3, but we'll go in here. And you can see that my camera can only do either half steps or 1/3 steps. So highlight your 0.3 and then hit enter. And now you are set to 1/3 exposure steps. Now this is a global effect, so it will affect your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. So let's look at that. So let's exit the menu. And right now you can see my laptop in front here. That's the scene along with the desk table that I'm on. Right now I'm set at 1/50th of a second at f4 at ISO 400. So the camera is saying that is the correct exposure for the scene in front. Now let's start with the shutter speed, and we're gonna slow down the shutter speed, therefore bringing more light in. So if we're at 1/50th, then 1/40th is 1/3, 1/30th is 2/3, and then 1/25th is 1 full stop. And you can see right now the light meter says plus 1.0. In fact, we have brightened our exposure by 1 stop. So if we go in the other direction, go 1/30th is 1/3, 1/40th is 2/3, and 1/50th is 1 full stop. And then we're back to the correct exposure. Now, if we go to our aperture, if we close down the aperture, we're at f4.5, that's 1/3, f5.0 is 2/3, and then f5.6 is 1 full stop. And we have darkened the exposure by 1 full stop. Right now, my light meter is saying negative 0.7. Eric, why is that? Okay, we're going to talk about this here in just a second. But this light meter is reflective. So what that means is if there's one predominant light or dark, that is going to fool the meter. So right now, because the left side of my frame here is dark, that is predominantly taking over the exposure. So even though right now it's saying 0.7, we have effectively closed our aperture down by 1 stop. So to prove my point, I'm not going to change any settings. All I'm going to do is turn my camera and you'll see how it changes the exposure. You see now the camera says it's at the correct exposure, even though I've done nothing to the settings. So we'll talk about that here in just a second. So we'll go back to where we're at. So right now it says negative 0.7, even though we have closed down by 1 stop. We'll go back the other direction. So F5 is 1/3, F4.5 is 2/3, and then F4 is 1 full stop. So we have double the amount of light coming in. Then the same thing with the ISO. We'll make it brighter. So we'll make the sensor more sensitive to light. So at 500, it's 1/3, 640 is 2/3, and then ISO 800 is 1 full stop. And then conversely, the other way, 1/3, 2/3, and then 1 full stop. Okay, so that is how you set up your camera to work in 1/3 increments. Okay, while we're on here, let's talk about the histogram. I don't know if you've noticed it, but it's on the bottom right-hand side of the frame here. And the histogram is basically a live representation of the scene in front of you. So if you're on live view, which we'll talk about here in just a second, it will give you real-time information as to the exposure. If you don't have live view on and you snap a picture, this histogram will tell you a snapshot of the exposure. So let's look at it here. So on the far left side is representative of your shadows. That's where all your shadows live. Then on the far right side is where your highlights are. Now, if you clip your highlights or you clip your shadows, that means that there's no information left in those areas. So let's start with our shadows. If I take and darken the exposure, and you can see now that on that top left part of the screen, it is completely dark. And if you go to the very top, it is completely black. And if you look at the histogram, you have that bar pushed up all the way against that edge, and then it's from top to bottom. So that's how you know you have clipped your shadows. And if you look at my meter here, my light meter, right now it's at 2.0. So if we drop even more, now we are completely blacked out in that far left part of the frame. And you can see my light meter is blinking at negative 2.0, saying that I am completely clipped and the blacks and the shadows, and there's no information there. So we go back the other direction and make everything brighter. Same thing. You can see now my light meter is blinking plus 2.0. You can see that top right area is washed out. It's just one big blob. And in the histogram, you can see where that bar is pushed up against the edge and from bottom to top. So it's saying that it is clipped. There's nothing there. If you clip your highlights and your shadows, even if you get it into an editing software later on and try to either darken the highlights or brighten the shadows, there's no information there. So the computer is not going to be able to bring back anything because the camera was not able to capture that data to begin with. So keep that in mind when you're out shooting. Try not to clip your highlights or your shadows. Okay, while we're here, live view is basically what you guys been watching, where you can actually see my camera, and as I change the settings, you can see the camera frame either brighten or darken. Now, because I'm on mirrorless, these are basically live view anytime they're on. This is more for the DSLR shooters, those people with like a Canon 5D or 6D or 7, Nikon, I think it's like the D5000 series, 7000 series, the D700s and 800s. Those are DSLRs which have a mirror in front of the sensor. So in order for it to go into live view, you have to turn on the live view and the camera has to flip that mirror up so the image goes through the lens and directly onto the sensor. And then basically you have what you've been looking at here. So prior to me shooting Sony, I had a Canon, and in my Canon, I had a switch where I flipped up and it changed from basically camera to live view. And when it did that, the camera automatically brought that mirror up, and then I could see what the camera was seeing, and it was a live view mode. All right, and that's gonna be it for this video. If it's been helpful, please give it a thumbs up. It'll help the YouTube algorithm get this video out to other beginning photographers. And if you like this kind of content, click on that subscribe button and then hit that notification bell, and then the next video that drops, you won't miss. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and until the next one, see you soon.